Well, look at that, a spectacular night on the British Columbia coast. That's North Vancouver. Very special view that you get when you're out here on the West Coast. Everything looks pretty spectacular. Why? Because it is. Hello there, I'm Peter Mansbridge. In Vancouver, we're at the Vancouver Convention Centre. Why are we here? Something very special. We're doing programming over the next few months. We're calling them digital town halls, an opportunity to discuss our journalism. We've got questions coming from you here in our live audience, but also on social. That's why we're calling it digital. We want to hear from you, whether you're watching this on Facebook Live, whether you're watching it on YouTube or on Periscope. Your questions about our journalism, our investigative journalism. Now, why are we focusing on that tonight? Investigative journalism is very important to us. It's also important, we know, to you. Why? Because it's a pillar of democracy in terms of the media. When you talk about the role of the media, we talk about investigative journalism. What we can bring to the table, news that you can use, news that you wish you knew about. Often, that's a lot of hard work for investigative journalists. So that's our topic tonight, and it starts right now. Being a journalist has allowed me to see Canada in a special way for almost 50 years now.
There's a story they tell out here on the prairies.
Through its communities.
We are a long way from our usual cozy studio tonight. It's about 3,000 kilometers that way.
This is the Northwest Passage. We're in a shaft of the old Syndicate coal mines here in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. Through its people.
Well, the Rosemary Brown table is all smiles right now.
Through their struggles. Do you worry about the ice?
What's going to happen if it all melts?
There's a story has been about.
Through their victories.
At stake today, Brian Mulrooney's place in history and a document that will shape the country for generations to come.
We always ask, what makes a Canadian?
Peter Mansbridge, CBC.
I've spent my career looking for those answers.
Create jobs in Canada.
They've all worked the coal mines in Cape Breton. Now they sing to preserve the heritage and the folklore of the island's mining community.
I'm not making this up. I was watching your show last night.
Meeting some extraordinary people along the way.
Often with a
Being witness to extraordinary circumstances.
Good evening again from the Berlin Wall.
This week we're in Vancouver to talk about something that's key to our work. We specialize in investigative journalism.
Anyone can use it.
What is it? Why do we do it? And how does it make our audience better informed? Well, lots of good questions there, and have I got a panel for you in terms of answering those questions. Got 5 award-winning journalists, many in the areas of investigative journalism. They're known for their great reporting. Let me introduce them to you, starting with Natalie Clancy from CBC Vancouver. Natalie's made her mark both in this province and across the country with investigative stories like the latest one over the past year, the crisis, the fentanyl crisis here in BC. Over here, Adrienne Arsenault, who is no stranger to a national audience. She has done investigative work not only across this country, but around the world, and we'll see some of that and hear her tips about the business in the next little while. Connie Walker from our CBC News unit that has been specializing and winning awards for its coverage of the issue of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. Ian Hanomansing here in Vancouver. Ian has been, well, he's been with me a long time. We've been colleagues, fellow journalists over all the years that I've been hosting the National. But Ian now has his own show on CBC News Network, but he's often in Toronto, filling in for me over the years, but also giving us great journalism on a number of different fronts. And finally, Diana Swain, who is our lead investigative reporter. She's our senior investigative reporter at CBC News, and she's also the host of The Investigators, a new program this past year on CBC News Network that's done extremely well on this issue of investigative journalism getting behind the stories, how we've been doing them, but also not just us, but other investigative journalists around the world. So a power panel, if you wish, to discuss the issue that we all want to talk about tonight. So questions will come from this room, from the audience here in Vancouver that have come out to watch us tonight, but also across the country via social, whether it's YouTube or Periscope or Facebook Live. We're looking for your questions, and if you're on social and you're looking for the how to do that, go to the comments section, put in your question, and we'll try to get to it. So let me start with Natalie Clancy on the issue that obviously is front of mind in this part of the country, but has become front of mind in a lot of other areas in the country as well, and that is this whole issue of the fentanyl crisis. Before I ask Natalie to talk about it, a reminder, this short clip from one of her stories.
Is it actually an overdose? Yeah.
Nurse Tanya Campbell races to a patient already here, unresponsive in the public washroom of St. Paul's Hospital.
Somebody grab the oxygen, please.
Wakey, wakey. She had Narcan times 2 from the Narcan kit.
You're overdosed.
Come on in, sweetie. Lay on your side. I'm going to take you to emerge.
She just got discharged from upstairs and needed a hit while waiting for a taxi.
Go ahead, switch the thing.
I always people say somebody's overdosing in the bathroom.
Her friend didn't inject as much, so was able to give her naloxone, the shot that reverses the effects of opioids.
Both of them did a hit, and the one who was the friend noticed that her friend had gone down and decided to use her own personal Narcan kit to try to save her friend's life.
She says, well, when you fix, don't do it all, just put half in. I said, okay, you too, but she put it all in, and she went under.
This is a horrifying and a frightening story, and one that has been brought to our attention by a lot of the journalism that you've done, Natalie. How'd you get access to stuff like that?
Well, you know, that was really difficult. It took months because we asked the firefighters, and they took us out. And the concern for us is always patient confidentiality. So hospitals and paramedics and even firefighters, they don't want to let you inside. So we had to negotiate. My boss signed a legal agreement undertaking that we would not violate patient confidentiality. And I was shocked when people said, hey, you want to do an interview? And this woman said, sure. Her name's Jerry, and she said, I'll tell you what's going on. And we've been surprised every time I go out in the street and I talk to people how much people on the front lines, both first responders, drug users, family members, they want to talk about this because by the end of the year, 4 people were dying every day. And we knew at the beginning of the year this was going to be a big story. We'd started talking to families, we started digging, but I had no idea by December, we'd be looking at 4 deaths each and every day.
Captain Jonathan Gormick is here with us. He's from the Vancouver Fire Department, and it was people like Captain Gormick who got us the kind of access that we would need, and that must have been a difficult decision for you and your colleagues to make.
I don't think there's any of us that wouldn't want access to see what we do in the public and the service that we provide and the level of service we can provide to patients. But part of the thing we have to balance is that our men and women do an intensely stressful job that's very busy. And the worry is I don't think all of them necessarily want access to the way that we cope with that stress on a daily basis once we've left the scene, once we've left the public or whatever facility we're in. So making sure that we're working with a partner who can respect what goes on and the challenges that we face and the stresses we face is paramount. And obviously Natalie mentioned a big part of it, which is patient confidentiality, but there's much more to it even in the public than dealing with the nuts and bolts of patient confidentiality and law. It's all about building trust, and it's something we've always strived to maintain, both with our partners, BC Ambulance, and with Vancouver Police, and with the coastal or the community agencies with whom we work. So there's always the worry that when we have journalists of any kind with us, that it can compromise that trust. It can compromise how patients work with us, how partner agencies work with us. So we need to go to great lengths to make sure that's maintained, to make sure that everyone that can potentially come in contact with the media while we're with them knows what's going on, knows that it's well-intentioned, and knows that it's not exploitative, that it's for the benefit of everyone, including the patients whom we serve.
All right, Captain, thanks very much, and thanks for being here tonight to help us on this. The questions have started coming in already from off social, and this one comes in off, I believe, Facebook Live. Loretta Johansson Diana, well, let me ask you this one. What are the panel's thoughts, and your thoughts specifically, Diana, on revealing your sources of information? This is topical. We've all been watching the debates going on south of the border, and you know, some in the Trump White House think the reporters should never go on with anonymous sources. Tackle the question, Diana.
I mean, in a perfect world, your sources are willing to reveal themselves. And it's important in a few ways. One, it allows us to tell the story in a very transparent way. And the person that you're hearing, you're also seeing. So they're really taking responsibility for what they're saying. They're allowing themselves to be held accountable. It's, you know, it's kind of the high bar. That's what you would love to have as a journalist. But sometimes, for reasons that are really, I think, pretty serious, people don't want to reveal their identity. And we don't just say, okay, you don't have to show yourself. There's a whole process that we have to go through, journalistic standards and practices at CBC that determine when we can conceal someone's identity. And so, for instance, if they think that they're going to come to physical harm, you know, say they're talking about a crime they've witnessed, or they've been a part of a gang, and if people know who they are, someone's going to hurt them. Well, that's a pretty strong argument for not exposing them. If someone is going to whistleblow against their boss and they're willing to put themselves out there, you know, we don't have any interest in seeing them lose their livelihood because they may have an entire family relying on them. But there are tests that we have to meet. And when someone is not prepared to, you know, go all in, to put it that way, we have to then make sure that we're doing our due diligence to make sure that what we're getting is factual and it's fair and it's not actually someone's attempt to hurt someone else's reputation. So, you know, those are the things that we balance. And if you have someone who can't, for whatever reason, be fully transparent about who they are, you know, the responsibility now falls to us to make sure that what we're putting out there would meet our own test.
And I think it's, you know, really important to do as you've done, underline the fact that this is not our preferred option, to go the route of anonymous sourcing. It's the last route we want to go, and there is a rigorous process, as Diana mentioned, to ensure that we're not being used in doing this, that there is a public service in reporting this story, even on the usage, even with the usage of anonymous sources. A question from the audience. Katie, who have you got there?
Hi, my name is Peter. My question is...
Good name.
Has investigative journalism lost a tool with the decline of traditional newspaper sources? And if it has, does that get picked up by television sources such as yourself or internet sources?
It's a very good question, and the whole issue of the decline of newspapers and the difficulty that newspapers are having. Investigative journalism isn't cheap. It's very expensive. And oftentimes when papers are in trouble, the first thing to go is on the investigative side. Not always, but sometimes. Ian, do you want to try it?
So I didn't hear the first part of the question. It was about the
decline of papers, how that's harming investigative journalism, and whether we're able to pick up in our business the slack.
Well, I mean, we were all sad to see the decline in newspapers, right? It's better for all of us as consumers of news and reporters of news to have as much competition out there as possible. But there was a time in this business where the newspaper industry, the big newspapers in big cities, probably set the agenda too often. And we had to resist, especially in television news, because so much of our time and effort is spent in going out and gathering the story, going out with a camera operator, that so many times 20 years ago, let's say, the day would begin by looking at the leading newspapers in various cities and saying, okay, that's what the news agenda is. You know, for reasons that are part of the sad transition away from newspapers, but maybe there's a good side to it as well. I mean, you look at CBC now that often sets the agenda with investigative reporting. We don't have to rely on the newspapers. And the other thing is, in terms of sources, social media, and the people who spend their days as investigative reporters will know this firsthand, has opened up so many channels of information. Now, there's a lot of noise there too. There's a lot of meanness. There's a lot of stuff you have to sift through. But you have the potential now to see so many people who have stories, who want to bring them to you in real time. And I'm seeing you nodding, Connie. It is a treasure trove of sources.
Well, I think it's also really unlocked certain communities that were maybe underrepresented or misrepresented in the past, certainly with Indigenous, reporting from Indigenous communities. Just the amount of traction we get on social media for our stories and the amount of interaction and engagement we have with those communities has really changed the ballgame in the last few years, not just for investigative journalism, but all of journalism. And that's been a key part of our investigations into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, has been able to connect with those families where they are, which is, you know, not everyone has high-speed internet on the reserve. My mom doesn't, or well, it's better now, but almost everyone has a cell phone, and almost everyone has a Facebook account.
All right. Connie, I'm going to stay with you on this question coming in on social, because I think it picks up on what you just talked about, I'm guessing here, in terms of a story that's impacted you, in terms of the one that's made the largest impact on your life. I think we probably know what it is. You tell us.
Well, it's been all of our reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because this has been an issue that's been ongoing for decades in Canada, but it hasn't been getting very much attention. I remember first pitching a story 10 years ago after a girl that I knew from back home had gone missing. And at the time, I was told there was no interest or appetite in pursuing that. And now, 10 years later, you know, it's been basically the majority of my work for the last 2 or 3 years. And in particular, working on this podcast about a woman from British Columbia, Alberta Williams, who was murdered in 1989, and her murder is still unsolved. And that's what our work has been focusing on, is the unsolved cases of missing women and girls.
Alberta Williams, the story you're talking about, Alberta's sister, Claudia Williams, is here with us tonight. And Claudia, the work that Connie and her crew did on the story, the podcast about your sister, the kind of journalism that's been done on that story, how has it impacted your life and your family's life?
Well, with the podcast on Alberta, the one that was produced recently, I would have to say that it's brought a lot of light in this investigation for Alberta. It happened in 1989, where we were hopeless on the murder of Alberta. So now for us, it's, you know, it's had a lot of light. There's more attention brought to Alberta's murder now. And for us, where we sat back and both parents have passed away, not knowing what happened to Alberta. So that leaves the brothers and sisters to find out what happened to our sister, and especially more so for me, because I was with her that night. I was within a couple of feet from her. So there was a lot of it that, you know, a lot of guilt for my part, because if I didn't turn my head, she'd be here today. So when the podcast was released, that helped me in dealing with a lot of things, and, you know, and avenues, and, you know, it just, for me, it was just, the investigation was fresh, new again, so it gives me a lot of hope that Alberta's case will be solved. And today I have more contact with the RCMP, more contact with other people who are willing to help. Private investigator, Ray Michalko, is on this. You know, there's more people on it, and, you know, I think without this podcast, I think we'd be more or less 1989, still sitting there in 1989, you know, kind of moving from one investigative officer to the next.
Claudia
I just
Williams.
feel that, you know, for other families, you know, for me, this is an experience that you know, these women didn't give up their lives. Their lives were taken. So for me, I just say to all the families, don't give up on them. They didn't give up their lives.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Claudia Williams. Okay, another question. This one's coming in from YouTube. Alashams Hassam. Adrienne, have you ever had, wait a minute, lost it, here it is.
No.
That's right.
That was too easy.
Yeah.
This is a really good question, because I think this could go to any one of us, but I know it's going to be special for you because every story you want to get on the air, you can't always get on the air. So have you ever had an important story that just didn't get airtime? And when that happened, what did you do?
How much time do you have? This is the problem we face every time we leave the building. Because one story, you pull at a thread and one story and another one emerges. And then you have to get on a plane and go. And it breaks your heart. One story when we were covering Ebola in Liberia, there was a woman we met who had been cured effectively, and she was sort of touched for the very first time. It was incredible to see. Samantha Power, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, talked about that moment at the UN. It was very empowering, but we wanted to find out what happened to her, and we begged to go back to Liberia. No, it's very expensive. It was very expensive. Because Gemma's story was a story of Ebola, because even though she was cured and she was fine, she went home and no one would go near her. Her job was to sell water in little plastic bags by the side of the road, and no one bought water from her. Her family wouldn't talk to her. Her neighbors wouldn't talk to her. She was devastated, and that stigma was almost killed her. These are the stories that break your heart a bit, that you really wish and you could go to, and they are all over the planet.
And but the other frustrating thing too, which I think is partly what the viewer was calling about, is the sense that you're sitting wherever it may be on the other side of the world, and you're on the phone talking to us, and you're saying this story's got to get on the air,
right.
And Toronto is telling you we don't have room for it.
No, wait, there's a snowstorm, and we're really full.
Yeah, I mean that kind of frustration.
Yeah,
that's tough.
It is, wherever you are, it feels like the most important, urgent thing. And it is so hard to pierce through the bubble sometimes of all the platforms we have. The best thing, the best antidote for that is digital. This has taken so much pressure off our shoulders, because if the National, God love it, doesn't have the room, there are other platforms where we can tell the story. And I sort of feel physically and emotionally better because of that. Because a lot more stories are getting told in a lot different ways.
And we live in this era now where there are so many different ways to tell stories. Obviously, the National is our most important vehicle, and it's an hour, unlike most other regular network programs. Ian's is an hour as well. It's 3 or 4 hours. He keeps going all
Far
night.
less important than the National. The National's here.
He's
my
just saying that.
down here.
All right, okay. Okay, smart guy, you handle this question then. Brian Keelan asks, and Ian, that's a good one for you. How do you maintain journalistic integrity when much news is seen as entertainment? And what is the difference between news that's entertainment and news that's important?
What's the difference between news that's entertainment and news that's important? Well, I think that first of all, we talked about how much time we have on the air and digitally. But let's just start with our programs. An hour for the National, an hour for the program that I do on CBC News Network. That's on, by the way, at 5 and 7 weeknights Pacific time, and at that moment across the country. I don't know how you look at those programs, Peter, when you work on the team that programs them, but you probably either use this metaphor or one very similar to it, but it's that of a meal, right? We all need to have meat and potatoes or some equivalent of that, but that's not all you want to eat. It's nice to have an appetizer. It's nice to have dessert. We have one grumpy guy that works on our program who probably is watching right now, who every time I suggest that we do something that's beyond the meat and potatoes of the show, he goes, "Oh, I'm not going to watch that. I'm going to turn it off at that point." And he works on our program. But I tell him that, when there always will be an important story from somewhere in the world that deserves more attention than any story we do about the worlds of entertainment or sport. That's always the case. But at the same time, we live in the real world, and as we sit there in front of our television sets or our computer, most of us, most of the time, are looking for that meal. And there is room to do stories that are entertaining and stories that make you laugh and stories that are fun. Probably the fundamental thing all of us hear as a complaint about news is when people feel that it doesn't live up to their expectations of being fair and balanced. But a close second in terms of complaints is that the news is so depressing. The news is so negative. The news is so difficult to watch that sometimes in our family they'll tell me they turn it off. And so we offer a bit of balance, and there is room. We live in lives that isn't always sadness and being depressed and being inspired to change the world. Those things are important. The world needs to be changed. We need to be better people and a better society. But you don't have to be so earnest for all 60 minutes, at least on my program.
I mean, you're right, and that's why, we all try to show at the end of our programs that, the sun is going to come up the next day. We try to leave you with something, if not light, at least hopeful. Even on a day when things have been, extremely difficult. Natalie, try this one. Layla Kasemi from Facebook. In the occupation, and this is another one that could go to anybody on this panel because they've all been in these kind of situations. In the occupation of an investigative journalist, do you ever have the fear of your own life being endangered?
Yeah, I've had some threats. It's a reality. There are people out there that will write you nasty things. I think 2002 we did a gang documentary, and leading up to it, I think I had 8 written death threats. I think gang leaders in Vancouver thought we were going to name them and out them, and we don't do the work of the police. And we took some pretty extreme precautions. I have special glass on my back door, thanks to the CBC. And you can't find me easily. You really protect your children and your name, because sometimes you never know who you're going to tick off. And we've done stories about organized crime. We've done stories about terror suspects, for example. And when I talk to new journalists who we mentor, I often say, be really careful about exposing your children and your family, and being easy to find physically, because there are people out there who can be dangerous. So yeah, it's a reality, and I've dealt with some pretty serious, times of threats, and you just be really smart about security. And the other thing we do that I think protects you is your stories have to be fair, and they have to be accurate, and they have to be in the public interest. And I think if you do that kind of work, then really people out there aren't going to want to harm you.
All right. Katie, you've got another guest in the audience here.
This is for Thank you. This is for Adrienne. We see you in so many dangerous places around the world and so quickly. And I'm wondering how many other people go with you to produce what we see on the television, and what their functions are?
Well, that's a great question. It really depends. It depends where you're going. We have been on shoots recently. We went to Mauritania a few years ago to trace the story of 3 young Canadian men, 2 of whom went on to blow up the gas plant in Algeria, and they had gone to terror training camps there. So in that case, we traveled with a security officer, and it was a producer and a camera operator who also edited. Sort of the sweet spot is a group that's small enough that you can all get in one car, but big enough that you can all get each other's backs. And because we file for radio and online and television, and there's a lot to do. You need help. You need somebody with their eyes on the road. When you go into different countries too, you sometimes will hire a local person who speaks the language and knows the lay of the land, and then someone else who drives. So it can be like clowns, in a Mini sometimes on the road. But every story is different, and sometimes it doesn't happen to me very often, but you go in on your own, or there are just 2 of you. It's really situational.
Let me show you a clip from one of Adrienne's stories from a couple of years ago. This was 2009. It was in Zimbabwe, where things got a little dicey. Watch this.
There are people from Chiazo who were buried here.
But allegations of mass graves persist, and near Chiadzwa, a cemetery worker told us they exist and took us to the spot in an overgrown part of the graveyard.
You say that there are 68 people in
68 people in there.
And you saw that happen?
Yeah, I saw it.
In a nearby office, he showed us the dozens of burial orders filled out in December. Names unknown.
One was shot here. Yeah, he was shot here, and the other one was shot here.
You saw one shot in the head,
right.
In the arm?
The other one was eaten by a dog. He was very brutally by a dog.
Okay, here's my question, and I'm sure the question a lot of people in the room would have. Zimbabwe, run by a brutal dictator. You're dealing with a story where you're trying to uncover facts about a mass burial site. How do you get a guy like that to talk, even with the promise of, you know, you're going to blot out his face? How do you get him to talk?
You know, it is completely counterintuitive, because I know how difficult it can be to get people to speak here in Canada. But I found sometimes when you go somewhere where the act has been so egregious, these were, you know, young men who were gunned down by Mugabe's men in a diamond mine area. They lived there, but nonetheless they were gunned down. When it matters so much, it's actually, you're in a situation where you have to tell people that maybe they should hide their identity. They have been that man was waiting for somebody to ask him that question. He had those documents. And he said, I have been waiting for somebody to ask me this. He wanted to give us his name, he wanted to give us his face, and we were like, I don't think this is a good idea. And then, you know, you have to sometimes say to people, I'm not sure I can do for you what you think I can do. This is heartbreaking when people see the camera and they see you and they think you are going to bring justice, you know, you're going to solve the problem, and you have to say, I'm probably not. I'm really sorry, but this won't stay silent any longer. So it's different. It's actually not hard sometimes.
Diane, here's a question for you coming in YouTube. Ben Corkett, who's watching on YouTube from Montreal. How do the now blurred lines between media activism and journalism influence the way an investigative journalist must now operate when reporting? Now that's kind of a loaded question.
Well, but I think it's an important one because, you know, I've always thought of activism journalism as when you really come from a particular point of view, when something is your life passion and everything that you do is around that particular issue. But investigative journalism can wander pretty close to that line sometimes. I was talking about the journalistic standards and practices, you know, sort of our internal editorial Bible. Here's the way you're allowed to do things. And, you know, daily journalism, the objective is to report the information. What you've observed as a reporter, you are now reporting back to the audience. Investigative journalism has its own separate chapter in there, because what we are tasked with doing is we can deliver a story that delivers a conclusion. But it's only after a very objective look at the facts that you can reach a conclusion about what they say. You know, that idea of, you know, talks like a duck, looks like a duck, probably a duck. Our task is to prove it's a duck. And sometimes in doing that, when your story delivers kind of a conclusion, people can feel that you're putting forward a position now, that now it's about activism. And so for us, it's important to make sure that we're finding the sweet spot. You know, the place that we're comfortable as journalists saying, here's what I've observed, here's what I've looked into, sometimes after months, this is the conclusion that we've reached, and we're confident that this is real. But it's not about saying, here's now what you have to believe, or here's the way the world should work. And that's the place that we need to be. But I think, you know, the real task for us every time we look at whether to do a story, and, you know, as Adrienne was saying, you know, frankly, we get more story pitches than we could ever possibly pursue. And you have the really unsavory task sometimes of trying to figure out which story you're going to do, whose story you're going to try to tell, what you're trying to expose, because there's a lot out there. But the bottom line is, do people need to know this? And why do they need to know it? And that sets you on the right path.
That is the public interest issue. You know, as we've expressed a number of times. Connie, let me follow this up a little bit with you, because you said something earlier when you were talking about the Alberta Williams story, where there's been so much criticism, much of it legitimate, of various police forces on this whole issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. You said that when you first tried to pitch a story on this 10 years ago, you couldn't get it past the editorial process, because they weren't interested.
They weren't
They weren't interested in moving in on this story. So the question following out of what Diana was saying, have you ever felt on this story, and you've spent a considerable amount of time on it, like you're more than a journalist, you're an activist on it?
No, I wouldn't say I felt like I'm an activist, but I feel like I'm in a unique position as an Indigenous woman who has personal experience with some of the bigger issues that are surrounding this. It kind of compels me to want to do this work because I feel like I'm in a unique position to report on these stories. And I can, because of my personal experience, I grew up on a reserve. My father is a residential school survivor. My grandparents are survivors. And I think that part of what my goal in reporting and investigating these stories is to really show how the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women is connected to the other issues that we see when we talk about Indigenous communities in Canada. And I think that I don't think that makes me an activist. I think I'm very firmly in my role as a journalist in doing that. But I think that, you know, it's definitely motivates me to help shed some light on that and help Canadians understand. Because for a long time, you know, I think that there wasn't the recognition that these are important stories or that these are issues that Canadians care about. And I think because of digital journalism largely, and the fact that we now have metrics that show this story has gotten this many clicks and it's been shared this many times, that there's now a recognition, not just at CBC, but I think across the country, that these are important stories for Canadians, and there is more work to be done to connect the dots and show where these issues are.
All right, Katie, where are you? Over there.
Hello, I'm Andrea. I think my question can go to the entire panel. You've been covering critical situations or very strenuous circumstances at home or abroad. And it would be interesting to understand how you deal with those circumstances. Being the fentanyl, being the Indigenous woman, how do you deal with those emotions? How do you get out of those circumstances and go home and it feels that, oh, I'm safe, I'm okay, but what about those people? Like, what is your, do you have, like, I think the link I want to do is PTSD. We know the military has a lot of those problems. How does that affect you on your daily work?
All right. I'm going to ask Adrienne to handle this. Let me just say, first of all, because you should know, that all of our journalists who are put or could be put in difficult situations, we spend a lot of time with them, and they go on special training courses to try to deal with what may come up, but also those who come back who are impacted and affected by what they saw or what they did, have the opportunity to have special help at that time as well. However, I want Adrienne to answer because she certainly has seen a lot of, you know, very tough things to see, as all the people on this panel have, but Adrienne's seen a lot. But let me add this question, just came in, picks up on that. Bailey Martins from Facebook. Adrienne, after coming back from a trip, do you struggle to reintegrate into society without carrying the baggage from what you saw?
Right. I would say a couple things. Firstly, generally, journalists are only now really starting to understand that it can happen to them too, that you don't have to wear a uniform to experience it. And as much training as you can get, some of the journalists who have had phenomenal training have come back and discovered later that it's really affected them. So they may have covered PTSD and then they find out they have it. And I think we're working, you know, Natalie is working with the union in particular to try to identify that and get some help. It's deeply personal for everybody. I have relationships with my stories, and I know that sounds strange, but I almost there have been times when I have come home from something awful where I can still smell like the iron of blood, and it doesn't leave my nose for a while. And I walk down the street, and I sometimes feel like my stories are constantly tapping me on the shoulder, and I have this little ritual with them where I let them do this for a while, and then at some point I have caught myself standing in the street and saying, oh, enough, you've had your time, enough. You stay here, I'm going to keep going. It is a strange little ritual, but for me, I also always, and I learned this from a cameraman a long time ago, I take a clean pair of clothes that I put in a bag, and it never touches where I am. And then I change into those clothes when I come home. It's crazy, right? But they have never touched where I have been. And it is part of like for me, kind of a process where I say,
I'm going home whole. And I have no idea if it makes a whit of sense.
It must make sense, or you wouldn't do it.
So far.
You know? But you quite rightly talked about Natalie's involvement with the union in trying to ensure that the proper kind of care is given to the thinking behind what our journalists go through. So Natalie, you handle it as well, but let me add this question to it because it picks up on the same tone. It comes from Nicole Mucci Mount Stevens from Facebook. How do you learn to separate yourself from your stories and those you meet while investigating them? How do you not burn out when you are so close to the story, with many of the stories being devastating?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think, you know, I'm a mom now. I've got 13-year-old twins, and I come home from a fentanyl overdose, and they get a 20-minute lecture, and they're never going to, you know, why they're never going to do drugs. And I talk to young people all the time about we live in an age where you can't be like the 70s and the 60s and the 80s. It's too dangerous to play Russian roulette and experiment with drugs. So you better get in sports. You better do something else because experimenting with drugs is so deadly. So many people we talk to and we interview are devastated. This year it was fentanyl. The year before it was all, we did so many stories about children in care committing suicide and dying, and it's devastating, and there's stories that have to be told. And we're human, and I think if you separate yourself too much, you're going to miss the story, and you're going to miss what's important. So, you know, it's something that I struggle with. I think we all struggle with leaving work at work and not bringing it home, because so much of what we see is happening in our own city. You know, and I've been to Uganda and interviewed child soldiers and had trouble coming home after that trip. The fact is that journalists are a bit behind. We're behind the military, we're behind first responders, because we all think we're so damn tough. And it can't happen to us, and the last thing you want to do is tell your boss you're really upset because you're not going to get to go to Africa again, or you're not going to get to cover the next big hotspot, you're not going to be in Aleppo. So it's something that the CBC is working on, and we're working on as a corporation to get better at resiliency training before we go away, and being able to talk to someone when you get back and talk about it, and try to leave it at home. And you know, the other thing about us is we have to look at the next story and look in our inbox, and there's so much more work to be done. So we just try to make sure we do a good job with the story we tell, and that we do a public service.
I just want to add one thing on top of that, because a lot of the stories that we are working on are tragic and do you know, have some serious elements. It's also, I think, as journalists, we have to think about the people that we're talking to and the subjects of our stories and their personal connections to what's happened, and how that affects them and their lives. And that's something that I know with the Alberta Williams Project that my producer Marnie and I talked a lot about, because this was Claudia's sister, and you know, she has other siblings, and bringing up these memories and talking about this incredibly tragic event that happened, you know, it has to affect people, and you need to be mindful of what you're doing as a journalist, and that with every big story there is some person's real life that's affected by that as well, and that's, you know, that's part of the struggle.
Back in the audience, a question. I think this is going to be for you, Diana.
Good evening, panel. My name is Hazen Colbert from North Vancouver. My question is, how can a private broadcaster do investigative journalism when there's the risk that their corporate ownership will shut them down, particularly in Canada, where we have such a very high concentration of very few corporate owners running all of the media sources?
Well, as public broadcasters, we'll try to handle it. There are a couple of different ways to go on that, but Diana, why don't you start?
Well, I would pick up first of all, it's a good question, but I would say, you know, as Ian remarked earlier, you know, as journalists, we've all been in environments where, you know, when I started, the daily newspaper still had an afternoon edition. And that was actually the edition that you were most panicked about in TV, to make sure that they weren't scooping you and you had an hour to react. It was better for us all when there was more. It made us better journalists because we had more to compete against. So I think everyone here would say that, yeah, we wish there were more private broadcasters, privately owned news outlets, because there's a great reason for that. You know, I don't wax on too much about democracy, but I think it's just a better thing. I would say, and I started early in my career in the privates, as we call them, in private broadcasting. My late father was only ever in private broadcasting. And, as easy as it is for us to defend what we believe the CBC is about, and I'll do that all day long, I know a lot of private journalists who are very, very good and who will not be cowed by their employers, who will stand up and say, hey, I'm a journalist and this is my job, and I'm going to stand here and I'm going to make sure the story gets told. There are lots of them out there. We certainly don't have the market cornered on integrity. There's lots of it. But having said that, I think it's tough. And, frankly, it's tough everywhere. As Connie talked about, wanting to argue for her story and not being able to get it forward a decade ago. Every journalist I know has had that experience of feeling passionately that this story should be told and having an editor saying, not right now, you're just not convincing me. So you can either get really frustrated or you can go back and reformulate your pitch and try again. And a good journalist never takes no for an answer, so you just learn to pitch until they, you wear them down. That's essentially how you do it. But I think there's probably less of that than we might be led to think, that there's bosses say, no, you can't do that story. And the best thing about it is the journalists talk to each other. So if it happens, the story gets out some other way.
I think it's really important to underline what Diana said. We all have colleagues in the private sector, whether it's in broadcast or print, who do extremely good work on the investigative side. And at times you look at what they've done and you go, wow, that must have been hard to push that one through, knowing the ownership of that paper. One of the best investigative stories that's been done recently, outside of the CBC, was by the Globe and Mail, by Robin Doolittle. Her work was more than a year and a half in the making. It's one of the things we haven't got to. The whole issue of the amount of time and commitment a news organization makes to chase a story on the investigative side costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, doesn't always lead to something. And so there's real commitment there. And on Robin's case, it was an issue surrounding sexual assault, and the stats she went through on a nationwide basis, it's a heck of a story. Diana had done a lot of work on the similar stories as well over the last couple of years. Anyway, I digress. Let me go to Bridget Peterson's question from Thunder Bay. We're getting a lot of questions on this tonight on social, and not surprising, it doesn't necessarily focus right to the topic we're talking about in terms of investigative journalism, but we're not going to ignore it either, because it's an important question in today's journalistic debates. Are you seeing a rise in issues involving fake news? And if so, what steps do you take to identify real news items and to avoid reporting fake news? One of the problems with the whole fake news debate is that people's definition of fake news has changed quite a bit over the last year, but let's try it anyway. Let's get a short answer from a couple of you on this issue, because it's a dominant issue out there. Ian, do you want to take a run at it first?
Well, let's look at the evolution of the term. 2 years ago, I don't think we used the phrase fake news at all. And particularly in the days leading up to the election and after the election, a lot of people used fake news to describe the stories that were indeed fake, that were on websites that looked like real news websites, but they weren't. And they often had things that were anti-Hillary Clinton stories, right? And so we discovered this huge world of news stories that weren't real news stories, and hence fake news. So up until about, the middle of November, that's kind of what fake news meant. And then all of a sudden, a lot of supporters of Donald Trump, both in Canada and the United States, turned it into an epithet, and in an Orwellian way, I think, turned it kind of upside down and started using it to yell at actual news organizations. Now, real news is a very dangerous term. News is something that you have to determine as an audience, as a consumer of news, by looking at many different sources and looking at the use of sources and deciding what you feel is credible or not, and then you make the judgment about news. That's why we don't have a government agency that determines who is a professional journalist or which organizations are actually news organizations, because we want to make sure that we don't have the official stamp of approval from government. But the point is right now, fake news is used as an epithet by a lot of people who are, I would say, based on my reading of my Twitter account and people who are responding, who are hardcore supporters of Donald Trump, who with a kind of metaphorical brush of the back of the hand are trying to put us in their place. And to me, that's like, you know, hearing a racial epithet. It's hurtful, but it doesn't mean anything, right? How does it affect us? I think it affects us in two ways. First of all, do we rely on fake news as we put together stories? Absolutely not. And I don't think, there's a good chance that none of you do either, right? You're sophisticated consumers of news. We certainly are as well. So that's number one. We're not concerned, I don't think, about fake news creeping in to our news gathering as sources. The second thing, though, is that we have a crisis or a potential crisis in the news business to reach out to those people who are using that term fake news and trying to bring them back into the tent, the really big Canadian tent of you know, being like you guys, being willing to be more critical viewers and readers and consumers of information, and not just say we're going to push you guys away. We don't believe in mainstream politicians. We don't believe in mainstream media. We don't believe in mainstream anything. And it bothers me when I see people who are just kind of dismissing not just us, but a lot of institutions. So that's on, well, I was going to say it's on us, not entirely, but we have a responsibility to try to figure out how do we reach back out to those people.
I think that's a great way of answering that question. You know, in simple terms, the best way to combat fake news, and those who are criticizing the media in general, is for us to do our job. Just do our job. Do things fairly, accurately, put them in context, do our job.
I actually think fake news might be the best thing that ever happened to us, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I'm not sure if people were bringing a lot of critical scrutiny to the work before. People were just kind of consuming what everybody was putting out. I think now if people are being challenged to really look at what they're consuming, what they're reading, what they're watching, and decide the difference between quality and stuff that falls far short of that, great, bring it on.
And I do think, if I do this, and another thing, I do think we have to change a little bit. You know, we've had this conversation, you know, we can't take your trust for granted. I don't think we ever really did, but we can't let ourselves get complacent. And I think when we tell our stories, we have to start being maybe more transparent. Why are we speaking to this person? Why are we speaking to this person in this location? How did we get here? Do you want to see the documents? Here's the link. Because I actually like that challenge. I think that's a good thing. I think that's good for us and for you.
And I think we are, as Diana says too. I think we're doing a lot more of that, all of us, the media in general. So they are responding in a way to some of the criticism, some of the legitimate criticism. Problem is, there's been so much, you know, crap in the criticism that sometimes, as Ian says, you just, you know, move on. Audience question here.
Hi, my name is Kayla. I'm wondering, when you have so many stories that you want to tell, how do you decide what gets airtime?
Hardest part of the job.
Yeah. You know, it is, well, Natalie, you take a run at it.
This is what keeps me up at night. It really does, because we have an inbox and we get story tips, and we get tips from mad ex-wives who want us to do stories about their ex-husbands. So you want to delete those. You want to make sure you've got a legitimate story. You've got to investigate the source of your information just as thoroughly as perhaps the target. We get a lot of stories in British Columbia about abused children, and those are the ones that keep me up, because you think, is there something in my inbox where something horrible is going to happen, and they're going to say, I emailed the CBC Investigative team and they didn't do anything. And that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. And we try to look and evaluate, what does the public need to know, and what's in the public interest, and what's going to help maybe more than one person. Where are some trends? You know, where are the stories we're missing? And this is, you know, what you don't do and what you do is a really hard part of the job. And it's great. We have editorial leaders to help bounce. You know, I've done a lot of stories, for example, on sexual harassment in the RCMP. I'm not crusading, but we do a lot. We've done a lot of those stories. And you check, you know, should we do this one? Is this too much? You know, you have to bounce it off someone else. I have a great boss, and I'll say, you know, is this a story or is it not? Because maybe I'm too close to it. But deciding what to do is probably one of the hardest things that we do.
And I think you have to appreciate that in a good newsroom, there are a lot of arguments going on every day, debates over what is a story and what isn't a story. On the very question you asked, is it worth getting into the newscast? If it is, where should it place in the newscast? And, you know, as I like to tell, as I'm sure my colleagues do as well, young journalists, if you find yourself in a newsroom that doesn't have that kind of discussion and debate, then you probably want to move on because you need it. You know, you're not going to win every argument, you're not going to win every debate, but the very fact it's happening is good and goes against this whole theory that everything's plotted out and planned and there's some, you know, decision-making process in particular newsrooms about what gets on the air and what doesn't, because it just, that doesn't happen. It certainly doesn't happen with us. Here's a good one from you. They've all been good. I mean, I applaud you for your questions tonight, both here in the audience and across social. This one's from YouTube. Elizabeth W. Have asked this. Connie, you try this one. Have you ever had a positive societal change happen because of one of your stories?
Well, you'd like to think so, for sure. You know, I think that there's different ways to measure what is a successful story and whether or not it was worth doing. And I think, you know, what Claudia said tonight about how in 1989 there wasn't any attention about her sister's death. And now in 2017, you know, there are people who are listening to her sister's story and hearing not just about the violence that led to her death, but about who she was and how she lived and hearing from people who loved her. And so I think that's really the biggest feedback that we've received from a lot of our MMIW coverage, not just me, but just I think from Canadians who said, I didn't know this before, or they didn't understand, or they felt like they'd heard this issue before. And I think that, you know, I don't know that that's, you know, the RCMP in Alberta's case says her case is now very active, and we'll keep you posted if there are any developments on her case. But the emails that we've gotten from teachers or healthcare workers who've talked about how it's helped change their understanding of the issue, you know, really, yeah, I think that's a really important change that I feel good about.
This is why investigative journalists get out of bed. This is what we do it for, is when you can do a story that has a result that helps other people. I mean, that's...
Yeah, and it, you know, in many cases of journalism, it doesn't have to be investigative to get that rush as well. Diana, did you want to add to that?
Just that, you know, when you're working on stories, there are many days, especially investigative journalism. We've talked about how expensive it is, and maybe haven't illustrated that. The part of that is because you're coming to work every day working on a story, and your bosses are going,
where's the story?
TikTok.
Yeah.
You know, could you put something on the air, please? And you're trying to get it together, and the stories are not always delivered. You know, it's not always something in an inbox. It's an idea, it's a thought, it's a wonder, and now you're trying to trace it down, and the stuff is not easily obtainable. And you're putting in many days where you feel like you actually leave the office at the end of the day further back than when you started. And when it comes together and you put the story out there and there's some impact and people go, really? I didn't know that. Or there's some kind of impact. You know, there's a buzz you get out of that cannot be replaced. And it's what keeps us doing it.
Yeah, we're going to take it, we're starting to run out of time, but we're going to try and which side? Over here, right here? And see, oh, there you are. Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Geneva. This is a question geared towards the women in the panel. How has the field of investigative journalism increased or decreased in its accessibility for female journalists?
Adrienne.
You know, I'm thinking about Zimbabwe because I met a mining minister, massive man, huge human being. And he just looked at me like I was just like a beetle on the road. And he actually said, look at her, you know, it's not a problem. Of course I'll talk to you. Those are the best days ever when people completely underestimate you. It is such a powerful weapon. Can we really go see your mind? Thank you. You know, sometimes you just have to bite your lip and just use you know, use the fact that you're 5'3".
You're not 5'3".
Who's talking?
You wish. Does anyone else want to add on that, Diana, on the gender issue?
Not to give away all our secrets, but a similar story. I remember very early in my career, I think I was 25. I certainly didn't look like I knew what I was doing, and I'm not really sure that I did, but I remember interviewing someone, and I was about to put something in front of him and accuse him of something. And I was actually sort of far more nervous than I ever wanted to give up, but he thought I was just adorable. And I remember him actually trying to charm me by speaking a little French. And I was actually so annoyed at that point that he clearly thought I was no threat at all, that, I stopped shaking, I stopped being nervous, and that might have been one of my finest moments ever. I remember it like 25 years later. So sometimes it's frustrating for all the same reasons that women in every profession have expressed their frustrations, but every now and then it works for you, and those are good.
I got one, I'm sorry, I'm getting conflicting instructions here in terms of how much longer we can go. We have time. We can have time for one or two more questions. So here's one from social. Gemma Kerr. Hi, I'm a journalism student studying in the United States from Victoria. Why are you studying in the United States? Just kidding. But there are lots of great J schools here in BC, as I'm sure you know. When you produce these stories, what kind of goals do you have in mind? Connie, what do you think of that?
Well, you want to enlighten people about something that they should know about and about something that's going to impact people. And hopefully make a difference and shed some light on an area that maybe some people don't want you to look into. But I think the main motivator for me is to try to make a difference in people's lives and help people realize the truth about something that they didn't know before.
Another question from the audience over here.
This is for all the panelists. My question is, have you ever reported a story that you regret?
Oh gosh, wow. Let's start at
Well,
that end.
yeah. You can take that a number of ways. I'm sure we've all reported stories that you regret because of the horror of the story, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. Have we ever reported a story that we regretted we even did the reporting on?
Well, I mean, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I will say this. The news business is a business of relentless deadlines. There's a newscast every day, and now with an all-news channel, there's 24 hours to fill every day. You are pumping a lot of material out there, and you're constantly trying, maybe not in the minute, but hopefully before long, to reassess what you're doing. And so I think on that level, we often are looking at the amount of weight we gave a story. Sometimes we nail it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we feel the story that we didn't allow on the newscast should have been there. Sometimes we feel one we did shouldn't have been there. So there is that level of regret all the time. Honestly, I think we would reveal if there was a big mistake we made and story we shouldn't have done. I can't think of one. Like, there is such a process of, if anything, we talk about the stories that didn't make it, because there's such a process of checks and balances before a story makes it. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but Peter, I remember as a reporter watching you during the 1984 election, when there was a major story that you ended up reporting about questions about John Turner's leadership within the Liberal Party, 88. And you were the anchor at that point, but you stepped off as anchor to be the reporter on that story. This was a leader of one of the major parties on the verge of an election, and before you reported that story, I assume there was a lot of soul searching and and that's the process we go through before something gets on the air.
Yeah. No, and I took a lot of hits for that story. It was basically that there'd been an attempt at a coup inside the Liberal Party, and this was during the campaign, to take Mr. Turner down. And, a lot of people criticized me and said the story was not true and was fake news. Didn't have that term at that time, but 6 months later, Turner's own people admitted, in fact, it had happened.
And you knew it had happened.
And I knew it had happened. Yeah, I mean, that was, as you said, we had to be sure. That was more than double source, which is our normal gold standard. But in a story like that, we had it triple or quadruple sourced, and we had no doubt about it, and just had to sit there and take the flak from a lot of our colleagues, many of whom, but not all of whom, had the courage and the decency to correct themselves when it was clear. Adrienne, back on that, anything a story that you've regretted doing?
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep, here in Vancouver when I was a local reporter, and regretted it only because it didn't have a fairy tale ending that I dreamt of night after night after night. There was a woman named Philippa Ryan whose daughter had been kidnapped by her ex-husband, and a police officer who was retiring said, "This is a cold case for me. Can you help us see if we can solve this?" We enlisted the help of a program in Spain that spoke Spanish because we thought this child had been taken to a Spanish-speaking country. This mom had breast cancer. We didn't know how long she would live. She wanted to see her child. Bottom line, found the girl some 23 years later. Mom comes into the studio. She puts her makeup on. She records a message for the daughter. We are so excited. This is, this woman is ill, and we're about to make this amazing reunion. The daughter took one look at the mother on the screen and said, "I want nothing to do with that woman." And I think I cried for like a week because I felt like we might have ruined that woman's life. Now, she was, at the end, we had good talks about it after, and she was happy that her daughter was alive and well, and that was going to have to be it. But regrets, I've had a few.
Okay, last question. John Hamilton from Facebook. And this is a person who starts off, or actually ends his message by thanking all of us for our dedication, specifically the five of you and the great investigative work that you've done. Here's his question. If you could change anything, what would it be and why? Anybody want to stand up and say, I would do?
No, I'll give one. And I'll say that, part of, and this is not just a shameless show pitch, though kind of, for the investigators, is if I could change one thing, I would want people to understand that we care about what we do. We care about what we say. We care about how it sounds to you. We care about whether you say, it's too much bad news, I can't take it anymore, you turn it off. We personalize that. We feel bad if we don't give you what you want, what you need, and what we're supposed to do. And I worry in this sort of the fake news environment, and people being angry and dismissive, that they're kind of dismissing what we feel most deeply about. And it is to our integrity, as Ian was saying, we care about this. This is what we do with our professions. And I think if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that even people who don't like us, people who don't like us because we're at the CBC, don't like us because we're media, don't like us because, I don't know what, because I don't like my outfit, my hair, whatever. It's okay, but know that we care about what we're doing and that we do take seriously our responsibility.
One short thing. If I could change anything in terms of my work, I would want there to be consequences when public officials lie to me.
Yep.
I would want there to be consequences. Yeah. And I would want there to be consequences when the federal government breaks the privacy law. When I file FOI requests for a document and they ask for a 6-month extension and we're at 9 months and I've got a big story and I know the document exists, they know the document exists and they don't want to give it to me and it's a story that you all need to know about. That pisses me off. So I would change that. And I would say I want government officials to be accountable when they lie to us and when we prove that they've lied to us with documents, because I have to be accountable. And if I lie in a story, I got to guarantee you I'm fired. I'm certainly not going to be working at the CBC. And you don't get 2 tries on that. We can't lie. We can't do fake news. We would be fired. So that would be my wish.
I have to follow that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let me change the answer a little bit. I mean, one of the things that drives us day to day on stories, whether it's the big investigative story or the smaller, quick daily turnaround story, is this kind of burning desire to either get an answer or set the record straight. And rather than me to finish by talking about what I'd want to change, I just want to say, not to sound too Pollyanna, but we are all incredibly lucky. I mean, you know, when I see what's happening in the United States, I think about how lucky we are to be in this environment where most of the time we live in a society that is secure and safe. You know, I walk around the station and don't have to go through, you know, bulletproof glass doors to get into our newsroom. People see me on the street and they feel like they can engage in a conversation, and it's a safe and generally 88% of the time respectful conversation. And we do have tremendous freedoms. I mean, we're in a country where no matter who is in government, provincially or federally, a 25-year-old reporter in a news conference broadcast live on all the news channels can ask a question that's not been vetted beforehand, regardless of the news organization that he or she is from. And there are just a lot of things in this country that we take for granted. And we should be very happy with that. And I think given what's happening politically in the United States, we need to remember that we shouldn't take it for granted.
All right. It's time for a number of thank yous. Obviously, a special thank you to the 5 panelists here today who've given you a sense of what it's like from behind the scenes on investigative journalists, but also given you a strong sense of why they do it and why it's important, not just to them, but to us as a society, that we have this ability to ask questions, spend time, go at certain issues that are troubling and try to find the answers to them. And, you know, as Ian says, we're lucky to live in a country that allows us to do that. We've all been in and reported in countries where that isn't allowed, and that is not a road that we want to go down. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank both Jonathan Gormley from the Vancouver Fire Department, Claudia Williams for coming here tonight to talk with us, and to you, the audience, whether you're here in this room or whether you're out there on social somewhere tonight. I know a lot of you have asked questions. We've got to as many as we could in the time we had. We will still try to get answers to those who didn't hear their questions asked tonight. We're looking at a number of different ways to do that, and we will be in touch with you to let you know the answers to those questions. So we thank you all. This has, you know, been an experiment for us tonight. It's the launch of a series of these types of formats that we'll do in different parts of the country. We'll be in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, a month from now, doing something similar with a live audience and hooked up on social as well. So if you didn't get a chance today or you think of another question, watch us when we're out in Charlottetown, and we'll listen to you then. So thank you for being a part of the opening of what we hope will be an important series, both for us to explain what we do, but for you to challenge us and ask us questions about how we do that. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.